All right, chapter 12 is all about personality, and it's going to begin with the main person who really started the theories and understanding of human personality, and of course, that was Freud. So, first, we're going to go over the classic perspective. That's the past perspectives on personality, and then we'll go into what's called the contemporary perspectives. So, the first perspective that we have on personality has to do with the psychoanalytic theory, which of course was Freud's. His whole purpose and thought process was that it was inner forces of who we have been brought up to be that interact currently to make us who we are. That, of course, was moved into the psychodynamic theory. So, psychoanalytic, you'll notice I just have a slash psychoanalytic and psychodynamic. That's because they're pretty much interchangeable as long as you take the sex aspect out of most of it. In order to understand where Freud came up with his theories on personality, we have to understand where Freud came from himself. He was always considered an outsider. Even when the first American Psychological Association was created, he was an outsider. Even prior to that, when his first ideas about personality came about. First thing you need to know is that he was a Jew during anti-Semitism in Europe. Then on top of that, that whole thing about sex and the behavior of infants and young children not only was controversial today, it was controversial back then. Now you're talking about a time where men and women certainly didn't talk about sex. They had the lights off at all times, and they even sort of pretended like sex wasn't occurring when sex was occurring. So here's this guy who comes out and starts talking about sexuality long before it was even deemed close to being acceptable. The next thing is that he left London right on the eve of World War II. He had 4 sisters, and only one sister made it out with him. The other 3 were killed in Nazi concentration camps, or 4 sisters were killed in concentration camps. He actually had 5, so there was one that lived. Now we have to understand his beginnings. So first, he's a physician. He's not a psychologist at all. He was a physician, and he figured out that while he was working with people, he couldn't find a physical reason as to why whatever issue came up arose. So he started to understand that there was an unconscious or without our awareness of mental processes that went awry and made physical issues happen because of psychological issues that were there. Of course, he named his theory, and his therapeutic technique was psychoanalysis for the psychoanalytic theory. Now, the main 2 things that we have to look at for psychoanalysis is free association. So he wanted his patients to speak freely and say whatever came to mind. They didn't want them to or anything like that. And then if they did, he did what was called therapist interpretation of why they were making those hidden or unconscious sounds and why they were trying to cover up what they actually wanted to say. So I have a cartoon at the side that says, "Good morning, beheaded. Beloved." A big thing that Freud was into, we call now Freudian slips. Back then, they were called slips of the tongue. So he felt that every slip that you make is actually an unconscious wish or a hidden truth to you that's making itself known or coming out. Of course, he did a great deal into dreams and understanding dreams, and we covered that earlier in one of our earlier chapters. You probably, if you've taken a psychology class before, you've known of the ego, the superego, and the id. It's a big part of what is discussed when it comes to Freud. Again, there are some things that have been told about it that are correct or incorrect. So let's take a look at it. The biggest part of who you are, and the reason it always looks like an iceberg, is because the iceberg that took down the Titanic. What they saw was just a little slip of ice, but what was underneath was so much larger and what actually did the damage. And that's what he said our whole self is about. That the underlying part, the part that nobody sees, the unconscious, is our id, and it makes up the largest part of who we are. That id tends to be irrational, illogical, impulsive. Of course, there's sex involved in that kind of thing, and all on the unconscious. So we don't even know when it's trying to take effect. I always look at it, if you've ever watched a movie, and when you watch these movies and they have a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other shoulder and the person in between, and they listen to the devil, then they listen to the angel, and then they make their choice, that's also a good description of the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id would be the devil on your shoulder. Now he's large. He's not just a little thing. It's big one, legs hanging down over your shoulder, and really controls quite a bit. On the opposing shoulder is your superego. That's the angel. That's all your ethics, your morals, the want to be perfectionistic. It is in what we call the preconscious. Now here's, if you looked at the iceberg, on that portion of the iceberg, there's the id that's underwater. Then when the water, because of the waves, the water comes up and covers up the superego, so it's in the unconscious, and then comes back down so that it can be seen again, which is in the conscious. So it's right at that point prior to full conscious understanding that preconscious works. It's uncovered, it's covered. It's uncovered, it's covered, sort of like the waves in an ocean or a lake. So that's your angel on the other side, a small little sliver, but very, very powerful. And then the head that's in between that devil and angel is your ego. It is fully in the conscious. It is where you actually make your decision of what you want to do, going one way, another, or somewhere in between there. So it is unconscious. Superego is preconscious, and the ego is conscious, and your understanding and making your decisions based off of that id and superego having their little discussion or argument take place. He also felt that there were two main drives that ran humans. There was the life instinct, also called eros, and a death instinct called thanatos. The life instinct was this need to perpetuate our existence. Now, of course, our libido runs in that because of our sexual energy to perpetuate our existence through our own children. So he felt that was a part of the life instinct. Then we have the death instinct. And he also said that sometimes we do things that are actually life-threatening behaviors, and sometimes we don't even recognize that we're doing life-threatening behaviors, and even when we do, we don't care. So there's that destructive part. Now, I always get asked, well, what about suicide? The suicide, according to Freud, would be when that death instinct took over and ran the show compared to the life instinct. Now, remember, both of these are running at the exact same time. It's like that energy, it's like that mood that we talked about earlier where you've got a negative mood and a positive mood both running at the same time. It's just who's in control. That's the way he looked at the two drives, the life instinct and death instinct. They're both running at the same time. They're both within us all the time. It's just who's in control at the time. So when we look at the death instinct, many of us would say, oh no, I've never had that. I've never tried or wanted to commit suicide. But you have without realizing it. Let's say you get into an argument with significant other, family, whatever. You get in the car and you drive like a bat out of hell out of there. So you're driving faster, you're weaving in and out of traffic, you're angry while you're driving. Many of you could reflect and say, oh my God, I could die driving like this. And Thanatos would rear its ugly head and say, I don't care. There's your death instinct. So, yep, it rears its ugly head at times. Now, I have a question for you. Are people innately good or evil? Now, innately means right down to your soul. Do you believe that people are overall good or overall evil? Now, I sort of want you to jot this down somewhere. Which one do you think it is? And then just leave it there, and we're going to discuss why you may have come up with the answer you came up with. Now, from Freud's time all the way to now, we find that there are more innately good people than there are innately evil. There may be one or two innately evil people that have done huge, horrible atrocities to others, but watch how many people there is that come in to help, to save the day, to do the good. They way outnumber the ones that were innately evil. And so what he found was that there's way more selfless behavior out there, way more positive behavior out there than there is the evil behavior. Now, one of the reasons why, if you have chosen evil, on that question that we just had the slide before, could be that you watch too much news. When it comes to the news, they put on the negative stuff, and they play it over and over and over again until you don't want to hear it anymore, but yet you do. And not only will they play that evil thing over and over and over again, but then they play the next one and the next one, and they just keep repeating it continuously. That's because what sells is negativity. Why people watch the news is for that negativity. And so they're actually looking for it. They did try to do news that was just positive and didn't have all the negativity with it, and they found that nobody watched. They quit watching. So they went back to it because that is what sold. That is what got people to watch. So we have to be careful because we watch it for the negativity, then we see that negativity over and over to the point that we start to begin to believe that everybody is innately evil. Everybody can do you harm, when in all actuality it's a few people that are like that, and the surmountable amount of people, or an insurmountable amount of people, that are good and will do selfless behaviors to make up for those bad. When we look at Freud, we have to understand his theory. Now, his theory was psychosexual stages. We talked about Erikson's stages, and we talked about Piaget's stages. Now we're going into Freud's stages. Now, Freud's stages are all based off of what he felt came through the id, and they were called erogenous zones. Now, erogenous zones to him were sensitive areas of the body. So it didn't just mean probably what came to your mind. It was sensitive areas of the body. Now, he said if we made it through these stages of psychosexual development, we made it through correctly, then we'd go on and everything would just be fine. If we didn't, then we became fixated at that stage where we couldn't pass it, we couldn't resolve it, we couldn't correct that issue. So when we look over to the right, I got a couple of cartoons that say, first one, oh, for goodness sake, smoke, because he's sucking his thumb. That's actually something that we have found that actually is correct a great deal of the time on that psychosocial or psychosexual stages. And then we have, I heard, as soon as we become aware of our sexual impulses, whatever they are, we'll have to hide them. And that is the main reason why we get fixated. So let's take a look at those psychosexual stages. Now, birth to 1 or 12 months old, we're going to adjust that to birth or 0 to 18 months old, about a year and a half. That's the oral stage of development, according to Freud. Now, the oral stage of development is all about the fact that you have reflexes. Remember the sucking reflex? Remember the reflex where you turn your head toward anything that's touching your cheek? It's all about the mouth. You're bottle feeding or breastfeeding, there's usually a nookie or some kind of sucky thing. They'll suck on their fingers, the infants will. They'll suck on their thumb. Whatever. It's all about that oral stage. They learn through that. They eat through that. That's their way they explore the world, is through that oral stage. Now, what he said about getting fixated or issues that came from it. What he found was that many parents would brag about taking that nookie away or taking that bottle away, and the earlier they took it away, the better they felt, the better their parenting skills were according to themselves. And what Freud had found was, well, wait a minute, when you take it away too early and they're not ready for it, then they become fixated at that oral stage. Smoking is the number one thing that is an issue later on in life when you're fixated at that oral stage. So there's smoking, there's chewing tobacco, a lot of alcohol or alcoholism is believed to come from that oral stage of development. Any kind of heavy liquids and drinking those on a regular basis. Maybe you feel like you're addicted to Coke and have to have it all the time, or Mountain Dew. If you ever notice the difference between those kinds of heavy liquids compared to water, you're going to find that you suckle constantly afterwards to bring those heavy liquids down. So in essence, you're suckling. That's exactly what smoking is suckling. So you weren't able to complete that stage of development, so you continue that stage throughout your life. And there's tons of things associated with it. Many people say they don't bite their nails, they bite the sides of their nails. That's an oral fixation as well. So lots of things that are associated with it. Now, mainly when Freud was doing this, it was because parents had taken away the bottle or the feeding oral gratification too early. Then, of course, we in the United States like to bounce back the complete opposite direction to an extreme, and we started letting children actually drinking from a bottle, breastfeeding, using those nookies well into 3 years old and 4 years old, well past the time that they should be using them. And we find that those individuals get fixated as well. So they have the same issue whether you take it away too early or too late. So I always get parents in classes that will say, well, when is the correct time? You'll actually be able to tell based off of your infant and your children. When they start dropping it or carrying it around by their teeth, or when they stop crying when they're going to bed and don't need it, you'll find that there's sort of stages that they go through on how much they need and how much they don't need. When you just shove a nookie in or a bottle in to quiet them, then you actually can increase the likelihood of them needing it longer. Let them decide, and they will let you know as you progress. Then we have the ages of 1 to 3. We're going to change that 3 again and go 3/4. This is where we're going to get a difference between the genders. This is the anal stage of development according to Freud. Mainly what's going on here? Potty training. Now, people will think that potty training is all about going pee-pee in the potty, but it's not. The main issue, pee-pee in the potty is pretty easy. Little boys love to sink your goldfish or whatever it is you put in there. Little girls just do it for the sheer fact that you praise them for it a great deal. But then they'll stop. And they'll need to go back to a training again. And the main issue is the anal portion, going poopy in the potty. Now, this one takes the longest, and we're not quite sure, but you'll notice that a child will go on the toilet, they'll go pee-pee, get off the toilet, pull their pull-ups on, go into a corner, make a funny-looking face, and go poopy right in their pants. And parents get very frustrated by this because they're like, what's going on? We really can't tell you that. We're not sure if they think some kind of big old eel is going to come up from that toilet and suck them right up through their anus, or what's going to happen. But they really have a hard time producing the anal aspect of that potty training. Now, girls can be potty trained, including both pee and poopy, typically around the age of 3. It can be prior, but typically around the age of 3. And boys will do it by the age of 4. Now, when we talk about that anal stage of development, it tends to be associated with early push to have this. We tend to do it most often with our firstborn children. So we want to be the best parents there are, and we look at what everybody else says is the best parenting skills, and you're going to have play dates with your kids, and then another parent's going to look at it and go, hey, our kids are the same age, and mine's potty trained and yours isn't. And then they're going to put you on the toilet and make you sit there until you go potty on that toilet. They'll feed you there. They'll read stories to you there. There'll be all sorts of things that parents will try to get you to do what they want you to do. And then what Freud said is that we become anal retentive. It comes right from this anal stage, anal retentive, where we learn that until we produce for our parents what they want us to do or what they want us to produce, that they will not be happy with us. So we learn that we need to either have maybe the best grades, or we need to be the best basketball player, or we need to perform in order to get love. From ages 3 to 6, yep, those are the right numbers, 3 to 6, we have the phallic stage. The phallic stage of development. Phallic means penis, P-E-N-I-S. Penis. So the phallic stage of development is all about pleasing your genitals according to Freud. This is when some masturbation can start. This is when sexual curiosity starts. This is when they start to be attracted to the opposing sex parent, according to Freud. So when we look at this, women that are listening to me right now are going, well, wait a minute. I don't have a penis, so how can I be going through the phallic stage? That's part of what Freud said. He said that girls don't have a penis, so they tend to be lost. And if they get stuck in this phallic stage and fixated with it, they will, for the rest of their life, want to be more like a man. They want to wear jeans like a man. They want to have a job like a man. They want to do things like a man because they can be fixated at this phallic stage. He also said that this is the time of curiosity where boys and girls are sort of looking at each other and going, what is that, or where'd yours go? So you've probably seen cartoons where, boy and a girl are in the tub and he's like, oh my God, you broke yours off, you lost it. And she starts looking around for it, trying to find where it is. This was part of Freud's understanding of that women continue to look for their penis. And then he went further later on to say that this is a part of them finding a relationship is looking for a penis, that kind of thing. Now, also during this time period is what's called the Oedipus or the Electra complex. And the Oedipus and Electra complex has to do with that attraction to the opposite sex parent. It's really quite the cutest time period. A little boy will look up at his mom and say, I love you. And I mean, they look at you with the most love in their eyes you could ever imagine. And they'll say, well, I want to marry you. A lot of times mom will say, well, what about dad? And you'll look at the kid and the kid will be like, well, I don't know. He's been around all this time. I don't care what about dad. I just want to marry you. They have no clue or understanding. Freud felt that they wanted to kill off the opposite parent so that they then could marry the parent that was the opposite sex. We, of course, know that that's not true. They don't really want to kill off that parent. They practice being just like that parent. If one crosses their legs, the other one crosses their legs. If they'll have pretend little kitchen sets or lawnmowers or anything like that so that they can pretend that they're doing the same thing as their same-sex parent so that they can practice being like their same-sex parent. They just love the opposite sex parent as much as they possibly can because that's really the only opposite sex person that they know and can understand their feelings for. We'll go into the next slide on the Oedipus and Electra complex. Oedipus is more for boys. Electra is for girls. Then we go into latency. Latency is the ages of 7 to 11 years old, and essentially what Freud said is nothing's happening now. This is when boys got cooties, girls got cooties. They can really learn the most during this time period because they're not paying attention to other individuals, nor do they care. And then he goes from adolescence, so that age of 12, all the way until you die is the genital stage of development. And that is all about not only becoming sexually mature, but then the primary focus is all about pleasing your genitals and having a sexually satisfying heterosexual relationship. Now, does he go into homosexuality or bisexuality or anything like that? The answer is no, not during that time period. So Freud doesn't go into that. Know that he is all based off of heterosexual relationships. So when we look at that Oedipus compared to Electra complex, Oedipus again men, Electra girls. Here's an example of it. Little boy pushing his little lawnmower while the dad is pushing his. This is when they have the most feelings and love for their mothers, for the Oedipus, and they feel like the father is a rival of some sorts. Same thing for Electra. They'll copy their mother, have the most love they could possibly have for their father, feel like mom's sort of a rival. Now, once we get past the psychosexual stages, we go into another portion of Freud's, which was vitally important, still remains that way today, and that is defending us against anxiety. He called them defense mechanisms, that we as humans all have and use defense mechanisms on a regular basis, and they're just strategies that we use to repress anxiety that we get. So we're going to go over, and you will need to know all of the defense mechanisms on this slide. First one we have is regression, where you regress to a more infantile stage. So for boys and girls, a lot of times we get big differences on them. Girls have learned that if they cry, they get their way more, so they will regress as an adult to crying to get their way. Boys will regress more to aggressive tendencies because that's what they've learned when they were younger, to be aggressive, and they'll get their way. So those are two different ones. Another thing can be that we find as people get older in nursing homes, anything along that line, they will go back to when they were young. They will go back to the fetal position. They will resort to sucking their thumb. They will do the things that they did when they were young that brought them comfort. Next, we have reaction formation, and that's when you switch your unacceptable impulses to the opposite. So unacceptable. So maybe sexual impulses. You now decide you're not going to have sex, so you become a workaholic, or you exercise to an extreme. You do the unacceptable, you repress that, and then you switch to something else. Okay. Now, another understanding of that would be if you've ever heard the statement, kill them with kindness. Kill them with kindness means that you are going to, you hate somebody completely, but you're nice to them beyond all reason, even over-exaggerating that friendliness to them because you want to not display the unacceptable impulse and do the direct opposite of it. Then we have projection. Projection is when you have your own threatening impulses and you attribute them to somebody else. So let's go back and think about that slide where I also asked you, do you believe people are innately good or innately evil? This is where we can look at that innately evil. If you think others are innately evil, the actual thing is that you think you yourself are innately evil. Projection happens with every human being. We do them all the time. So you really have to look at what you think about others and reflect back and figure out why it is that you think that about yourself. So, for example, you're in a group of people and one of them say, humans are just liars. They're all liars, or everybody's a liar, or the first person to accuse somebody of thievery or anything like that. Why do they think others can do it? Because they themselves do it on a regular basis. Then we have rationalization. I love rationalization. Rationalization is just self-justifying explanations. They're called excuses in our day. So, for example, when I was teaching and I was younger, I wore high heels constantly. And I had quite a collection of them. In fact, I had to build quite a large closet in order to just keep my heels. So when I went with my significant other or with my kids shopping, they'd see the shoe section and they'd grab both arms and try and propel me past it. And I'd say, oh no, I'll just go in and just look. There's excuse number one. I'm not going in to just look. I'm going in to just look to see if I can find something I can purchase. The other thing is that you can do that a lot of people do will say, I bought this because I had a coupon or it was on sale online. I had a coupon code. Any of those things. They're self-justifying explanations or excuses to do something that you really probably shouldn't have done. Okay? Displacement is another one, and that's where you take out your aggressive tendencies on someone or something else that is easier to take it out on. So let's say as a child you remember coming home, and when your parents came home, they started slamming the dishes, slamming the cupboards, throwing things around. You knew to hide because that anger that they had from work, they are now taking out on the dishes and the cupboards, but could easily be taken out on you if they didn't start with you. And you could never fix that because there's nothing you could do to really get them back on track to try and fix it because they can't take their anger out on the actual person that they want to. They're just not capable of doing it. Denial is next, and that is just to deny or refuse to believe anything that's painful. We have that happen, of course, with death. When somebody's told that so-and-so has died, they're like, I can't believe it. That statement is more than just a statement. It is the firm understanding that their brain can't understand and will deny the acceptance of that death for a while first. A big one that it's well known for is affairs. So people outside of a relationship will find it unbelievable that somebody in that relationship can't see that affair. It's called undeniable proof, and that's because of denial. They will need undeniable proof. It's not, they'll make excuses. We bring people into our inner circle and we say, I trust them. So, and if I don't trust them, I don't trust myself. I don't trust my decision making. So I must trust them beyond anybody else. And until undeniable proof comes into play, they will still deny. Now, do they do this consciously? No. This is a subconscious and unconscious activity that takes place. Next, we have sublimation. Sublimation is just being extra good. So you are really trying to divert your energy to a more acceptable goal at the end. So, for example, as a teenager, you want to go to a party. You know your family's going to say no. So what you do is come home and do the dishes, clean the house, cut the grass, make your bed, clean your room, wash the car. You do an extreme amount of good things for that goal of going to the party. So you're really diverting your energy to get what you want at the end. Then we have repression. Repression is unconscious forgetting. We've talked about that before. You have no control over that. So you're in an accident and you can only remember part of it, or sometimes you can't remember any of it. That's repression. The brain is deciding whether you can handle this information or not, or whether it will ever give you that information or not. Next, we have undoing. Undoing is when you do something bad and then you have to fix it. Okay, so let's say you're at lunch when you're a kid and mom packed you carrots for dessert. And then your best friend that's sitting next to you has cookies and a brownie, and you're like, geez, I want some of those. When you ask them, they maybe say no. But then they say, hey, watch my lunch. Well, I go to the bathroom. I'll be back in a second. Make sure no one takes my stuff. So what you then do is eat their cookies and their brownie. And then when they return, you pretend like you're talking to somebody else. You didn't notice somebody had stolen their stuff. They ask you and say, hey, my brownie's gone, my cookie's gone, what happened? You're like, I don't know what happened. Not me, kind of thing. So that is undoing in the first portion, but there's a second portion to it. You will feel guilt by doing this. So once you feel guilt, now you have to undo it. So you will say, I didn't take those. Remember, you never, ever will tell them that you did it. Never. But you'll fix it. So you'll say, nope, I didn't take those, but tomorrow I'll bring you a whole box of cookies or a whole 9x13 pan of brownies or whatever to undo the bad that you did. And then the last one is actually no defense mechanism, otherwise known as coping. Now, I've heard people write to me and say, because this is going to be an essay question, guys. They'll say to me, well, coping is you can't deal with the death that's happened, so you get drunk. That's not coping. Coping is doing it the correct way, doing it the right way, dealing with it the right way. So, for example, you have a friend that lies to you and you tell them straight up. You confront the situation. You lie to me all the time. If you lie to me again, I'm not going to be friends with you. So not only do you confront it, but if they lie to you again, you stop being friends with them. Defense mechanisms are the correct way to cope. Means confront the situation, do it the best way you can, and follow through to make sure that that doesn't occur again. Now, once we move on from the psychoanalytic theory, then we go with that psychodynamic that's a part of it. And Jung, Adler, and Horney all propelled forward on that psychodynamic theory. And the main thing that I really want you to know under this is Horney, who really hated Freud for the fact that he made women subordinate, he made them weak compared to men, and she really tried to prove him wrong. And the main thing that she couldn't prove him wrong on was the fact that when it comes to relationships, females feel far more secure in who they are when they're in a relationship. And then when they're not, they don't have that same security or understanding or self-esteem of themselves. Men can go on and a relationship is fine, but it's not vitally important to them the way it is for a woman. And we can see this when we talk to older people and men who are not married, don't have a relationship. They have a wonderful job, though. They make a good income. They have friends. They have their house. They have all their things in place, but just not a relationship there. And they don't need one. But when it comes to women, they can have that perfect job, their house, everything that they need, but they still feel like something's missing. They still feel like there's something empty inside them, and that has to do with the security that goes along with a relationship. Now, when we move on from the psychoanalytic and psychodynamic theories, what came to be following those and built on those was the humanistic theory, which of course Maslow and Rogers are two big aspects of the humanistic theory. We already know Maslow is all about becoming that self-actualized person that moves into that self-transcendence and helps others. Rogers, on the other hand, said when he was looking at the humanistic theory, it was about being the best that you could be. And you had to do that through genuineness, acceptance, and empathy. So let's look at those three things. Genuineness means to be not only genuine with yourself, but with others. He said that we put on a facade. That's what that word is, a facade. And so that we have this facade for others of who we think that they want us to be, and we sort of try to act that way. But we also put on a facade to ourselves. Excuse me. So that facade to ourselves, when we say, I would have done that instead of what you did, we're putting on this facade because we don't actually know what we would have done unless it actually happened to us. We are stating what we would hope we would do if we were being our best selves. So we should be more genuine. Don't say that you would have done it a different way. Understand that whatever way was done to the best capabilities that person had at that time. And you can't completely understand what you would do because you're not in that situation. Next, you should be accepting. You should have unconditional positive regard. Now, that unconditional positive regard goes both ways. You should have unconditional positive regard for others, for the situations that they're in, for whatever it is that they have done, because they're making the best decisions that they can, the best judgment calls that they can on the information they have, the economic status they have, the love and self-worth that they have, all sorts of things that are different than yours personally. But he also said you should have unconditional positive regard for yourself, that you should give yourself a break sometimes. So sometimes there are individuals that are too hard on themselves. Would you be as hard on somebody else, or would you be more accepting if that happened with somebody else? So have unconditional positive regard for yourself and for others. And then the last one he said was empathy. You need to understand the feelings of others. You need to listen well, not just talk the whole time, but listen well to others and their efforts that they've put into. You need to put in effort to understand them and feel what they feel. And until you get empathy for others, it's very hard to understand others' decisions that have been made. Now, when we look at Freud's legacy, even though Freud was a long, long time ago, we are looking at somebody whose ideas have withstood the test of time, that his defense mechanisms still are around, our sexuality and the irrationalities that we have are all still around. He's been on Time magazine a ton of times, even past his death. And the reason is a lot of what he said not only was true back then, but remains true to this day. Now, mind you, when he's wrong, he goes way off the deep end with it, but most of it is considered true to this day. Now we can go into the contemporary perspectives. Those are the perspectives of today. So when we look at those, we have three main areas that are going to be contemporary perspectives. First has to do with traits, genetic traits that you have innate in you. The social cognitive theory has a lot to do with Bandura. or Bandura, whichever one. And then the self, we call it the core self. So let's start with traits. Do you consider yourself a perky person? Yes or no? How about, do perky people annoy you? Yes or no? And yes, you can be perky and have perky people annoy you. Both of those things are traits. So whether you find them annoying or whether you are them yourself, or both of those things, those are personality traits. So we have to look at the trait theory of personality. The trait is an enduring quality that you act a certain way. Shy is a trait. Now remember, when we look at traits, they're all on a spectrum. There's shy that you can't walk out of your house to shy, I don't want to talk in front of 1,000 people. So there's a range of shy. There's a range of honest. There's a range of hardworking. So all of those things are built on a range based off those traits, which gives us the trait theory of personality, saying that you have predispositions to behave a certain way based off of your traits, and they're handed down and from generation to generation, and they're different from person to person. Now, what I mean by handed down, you get 23 from Ma, 23 from Pa, but why aren't you exactly like your brothers and sisters? Because those traits get handed down, slightly adjusted. Some come more, one child could have more from Pa and less from Ma. The next child could have more from Ma, less from Pa. Even twins can have those personality traits handed down just slightly differently. Now, when we look at theorists that look at these personality traits, there's a variety of them. This is based off Esnick. Now, Esnick said that you can be a stable personality to an unstable personality, and it doesn't matter if you're introverted or extroverted. There's bad and good on either side of that. So when you look at this, look at what you would be described as by other people, and where would you lie, on the stable or unstable side, more towards the introverted or extroverted side. Now, there's a term on here that students always have a difficulty with, and that's the term between unstable and introverted. It's called sober. Sober does not mean, in this context, having to do with alcohol at all. So it's not whether you're drunk or sober. Sober means no personality at all in this context. So you may have met somebody that talks monotone, that seems like they have no personality at all. That's called a sober personality. Now, when we test personality, there's a couple of different ways we do it. Projective tests or self-report inventories. The first projective test that really came about was the Rorschachs. The Rorschachs are ink blot tests. And yep, he really did put drops of ink on it, squash that page together, maybe even squash it again the opposite direction, open it up, and then ask people, what do you see here? Now, they're very ambiguous, which means you can't really see exactly something in there. But the minute you look at it, what came to your mind first? Now, typically in class, I'd hold up these Rorschachs, there's 12 of them, and have you guess and say what you think was there and tell you a little description. What I want you to do instead is Google Rorschach tests. Now, there's newfound ones that are out there as well, but you'll get a gist of what that test is about. There's no real correct answer. But yet, when the person was establishing this test, they found that the people that they asked really came up with a lot of answers that were very similar, if not the exact same thing. And then he found personality traits that seemed to run through those individuals, and then decided that those personality traits were aligned with what you saw. Now, because it's so ambiguous, do we use it to this day? No. There's no reliability. There's no validity. Whenever I pulled them out, it was just for an amusing thing. We weren't getting anywhere, and I could find more based off what their mood was that day and then be able to delve into it, which is also good and bad. So one day you're having a really bad day, you're going to see more negative images than the day that you're having a really good day. Now, when we look at personality inventories, the number one personality inventory that we have out there, which means it's a questionnaire on your personalities, is the MMPI. It's the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Now, we only call it the MMPI. Nobody ever calls it the full name. The MMPI has a built-in lie detector test with it as well. It can be, once you do it, sent in to a company that will give you the results, or you have all these individual sheets that they send you, which is the one that I have, that you look for all sorts of different things, including the lie detector portion of it. Now here's some examples of the MMPI questions that are out there, and you could have yes, no, or somewhere in between. You could have I don't care in the middle, that kind of stuff. And what they do is they ask you so many questions that you're going to find it seems like the questions are repeating themselves, but they'll be just altered a little bit. And you won't be able to remember where that question was to remember how you answered it before or how you answered it the last 16 times you've asked it. There's all sorts of ways that they have set it up to make sure that you're answering honestly. Here's an example of an outcome of an MMPI. If you look over in the blue, that's the stuff that's bad. So anything that when you're coming out with the results of this test, they go into the blue, those are the things we're going to work on. Now this you can tell there's depression there. That's the biggest point. So you'd think that's the biggest issue, but it's not. And then we have psychopathic deviancies is an issue, which is just a disregard for social standards. Then we have masculinity and femininity as an issue. And then we go to psychasthenia. And that's where there's guilty feelings, anxiety that's brought about. Now, this individual at that time was somebody who was a homosexual, and that homosexuality they had in a household that was very religious, didn't allow them to be who they were, said that they wouldn't love them if they were anything other than heterosexual. And so that's why a lot of this came, the depression, the psychopathic deviancies, that guilt feeling, all that kind of stuff came to be. So once we could work with them about an understanding of who they were, and an understanding of the way people react, then they, of course, came down and could have a better understanding of who they are, so they weren't as concerned about the way others reacted to them. Now there's other questions that we have out there. Well, there's one called the 16PF. No, there's not 16 questions on it. There's 185 of them. And there's example questions that are over there under A. And then what we get is under B. So this a lot of times will be used in schools or something similar to it to figure out what kind of job you want to go into. So when we look at it, an airplane pilot, which is in blue, compared to a writer, they have two different sides of personality that we really need to evaluate to see. Somebody who's an airline pilot is controlled, very controlled, but they're relaxed under, highly intense situations. Where if you look at the writer, not as much. Where a writer needs to be more intelligent in the abstract thought processes than the airline pilot does, or they have to be more sensitive or imaginative, where the airline pilot has to be more tough-minded or practical. Now, when we look at all of these people and theorists and what they discuss as far as personality, they all agree on what we call the Big Five. You will need to know the Big Five. Now, you can do it based off of this mnemonic device of CANOE, C-A-N-O-E. So when you look below, you'll be able to see what those each represent. The C is conscientiousness, A is agreeableness, N, neuroticism, O, openness, E, extroversion. So again, it's all on a spectrum. So what they did, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, is a dog there. And so they took that dog and they decided to do a Big Five personality test on him. And what they found was that the dot is more towards the disorganized, careless, and impulsive side than it is the organized, careful, and disciplined side. So under conscientiousness, he's down towards the disorganized. Agreeableness, he was very agreeable, soft-hearted, trusting, and helpful, rather than ruthless, suspicious, and uncooperative. He's up more on the neurotic side, anxious, insecure, and self-pitying, rather than self-satisfied and secure. On openness, he's more practical, preferring routines and conforming than he is imaginative and independent. And then for the extroversion, he's more sociable, fun-loving, and affectionate than he was retiring, sober, again that sober term, and reserved. Now what we also know is that people change and remain the same over time. So as you progress through age, you change less than you do when you're younger, and you start to become more consistent. So when we look at children, they're the ones that can have their personalities change the most. When somebody's in college, they can have it change the most. Mainly it's the educational understanding. For K through 12, pretty much what you're taught is based off of what the voting system is in that area. If it's conservative, they'll only teach you conservative thought processes. If it's liberal, then they'll teach you liberal thought processes. When you get to college, they teach you based off of research and facts, not off of opinions or what the most popular thought processes in the area are. So they get more open-minded, they get more understanding, and they get more empathy, which then can change and alter that personality a bit. But once you get past that, then you start to solidify. The more you get in age, the more you cannot change that personality. Now, when Facebook came about, Facebook was all about an understanding of affecting who you are and you affecting the personalities of others. So let me put that in layman's terms. It doesn't even have to be about the Facebook, even though Facebook is. Let's look at your phone. It used to be, what is the picture that comes up on your phone the minute you look at it? That's about you. You put it there because it was about you. And every time you look at it, it implies to yourself who you are. So it re-solidifies who you are. Same thing with Facebook. What is it that you put on your profile picture? What is it that you have in that background? Those are all about you. What you're posting is all about you. And the more you see, the more about you, the more it affects you to remain that same. So it can affect your personality. The social cognitive perspective is all about Bandura, and Bandura had said that it is all about the social context that will decide the way we think. Now, we've discussed this a little bit before, saying that when you're with grandma, you talk to her differently than you talk to your significant other, and you talk to them differently than you talk to your boss, and then you talk to them differently than you talk to your peers and your friends in your friend group. So those are all about the social context, and that we think and we put ourselves in those situations based off of the social context, and the way we behave is based off of that social context. Now here's all of those different theories and the assumptions, the view on the personality, etc. You can read through that at your leisure. It's essentially what we've already gone over. The one that's not on there is the core self, which is what we're going to go into next. So looking at our core self, it's our core personality. There are things that have been studied about that core self that we're going to go into on the right there. So let's look at the spotlight effect first. So in the spotlight effect, Barry Manilow was a crooner, what we called a crooner. He was a man who sang, and probably your parents to your grandparents, your mom definitely knows who he is, because all the teenage girls loved him, massively in love with him. But then he fell out of favor with everybody, and so it was almost an embarrassment to say that you loved him. So you might have had a t-shirt of his with his face on it, but you wouldn't admit that you had that t-shirt. You'd tuck that away in the back of the drawer, pretend it never existed. So what they did with the spotlight effect was take those t-shirts out and say, all right, now you got to wear them. Now you got to wear them in public and see how people react. Well, past K-12, past that high school experience, nobody really saw the shirt, nor did they even care. So we have this feeling because of high school, because of being in that spotlight effect, where everybody knew what you were wearing, everybody either liked it, didn't like it, saw whether you had a zit or not. You were so in the spotlight that we, throughout the rest of our lives, tend to think that we continue to be in that spotlight and assume that people see us more than they do. So think about the last time you went into a store somewhere. Were you really paying attention to everybody you passed, or were you more intent on what you needed to do for yourself? The more you progress through age, the more that spotlight effect for others is completely gone. Yet we still believe that that spotlight effect is on us. Why do you think Botox is so popular? Women are terrified that other people can see and recognize their wrinkles and go, oh my God, look at those wrinkles. She must be old. So that spotlight effect has had such an effect on them that they continue to try to change that and make themselves look better in their own eyes so that they feel like they look better in everybody else's eyes. Self-esteem is next. Now, you may have been told when somebody's picking on you that it's not about you, it's about them, and that is actually true. Self-esteem has to do with how you treat others. People with high self-esteem do not worry about other people's or insulting other people. They're not saying to themselves or to others, well, I can do that better than them, or God, that's terrible, or anything negative, because they don't need to say anything negative because they feel good about themselves. The only reason they'd say something negative about somebody else is because they themselves don't have the self-esteem to feel good. So what makes them feel better is to bring somebody else down. Prejudice is bred out of low self-esteem. Prejudices come from needing to be critical of others, needing to insult others, needing to not like others because they don't like themselves. The next one we have is the self-serving bias. Now, of course, Lucy was a big one for the self-serving bias. She was really good at finding everybody else's faults, but not really looking at her own or seeing her own or even allowing to see them. Now, when we look at the self-serving bias, that is any time you say, well, at least I'm. At least we're. Anything like that, you know they're about to come up with self-serving bias so that they can defend themselves, is what they feel. So I've got a few on a wheel, and that wheel's going to spin around, and we can take a look at a few of them. It says, at least I'm not as dumb as she is. At least I'm not as old like her. At least I'm not as poor as them. I work harder than them. So let's take a look at that wheel. You can read them for yourself. Know that anytime somebody says, well, at least I'm, when they're trying to compare themselves to somebody else, it's a self-serving bias. They don't have self-esteem. They're trying to make themselves feel better by taking somebody else down. Now, self-focus and narcissism. We go through generations of narcissism where we can have one generation extremely narcissistic and the next generation they're not. We go through ebb and wave of this all the time. It depends on how much empathy they have. The more narcissistic the society is, the less empathy they have. The less narcissistic they are, the more empathy they have for others. So we have to be careful about this narcissistic society because we become self-gratifying. It's all about ourselves. It's all about what I can do for me. I don't care about you. Now, we also need to look at the fact that we are an individualistic culture. Western culture, us, the United States, is individualistic. It's all about your independence, all about who you are, and we define ourselves individually. Just look at a resume and what we put on a resume. This is what I did, this is how much I did, this is all the stuff I've learned, and it's all about I. Now, when we go into collectivistic cultures, there's more empathy for others. It's not all about I, it's all about us. A resume then is what they were a part of as a group. So we have to look at the differences between individualistic and collectivistic cultures to also understand that core self and the why we do the self-serving bias and why we try to insult others so that we feel better about ourselves. There are three main aspects that we need to know. In collectivistic cultures, the behavior of others attributed to a situation where we say it's attributed dispositionally to the personality. So let's say somebody walked in a classroom door and they tripped as they were walking in. We all laugh. Collectivistic cultures would laugh too. But when we did, in the United States, they're going to do it dispositionally. They're going to go, oh, geez, that person's a klutz. Klutz is personality trait. They're going to say, oh, they're drunk. You know, that drinking before class is a personality trait. They're going to come up with something that says that that person is a bad person themselves and automatically attribute it to them dispositionally. A collectivistic culture automatically attributes it to a situation. So they will say, all right, the rug must have been turned up, or the door blew forward, or they were carrying too much stuff and things moved in their hands and made things awkward for them. So they'll look at the situation rather than the disposition or the personality of the person. The second thing that happens is that in collectivistic cultures, they give credit for any successes they have to others, not themselves. In an individualistic culture, we attribute it to ourselves. Just look at the Olympics. In a collectivistic culture, they'll say, my government got me here, my community got me here, all the other people that helped them to get there. In an individualistic culture, they will automatically say, I worked really hard for this. But they don't look at who helped them to get there. And it's not just mom and dad. Mom and dad can't afford all that stuff. It can't be just Nike that affords all that stuff. What about all the free stays at those resorts? What about the government money that goes into Olympics? What about all of those things? Nobody gets thanked for that. It's all about us individually. Think of yourself. When you have a success and you wrote an excellent paper, you worked hard at that. You did a great job at it. If you didn't do it well, do you attribute it to others? That's exactly what we do. The teacher didn't like me. They didn't tell me what they wanted from me. It's the success is yours. The not success doesn't have any ownership for us in an individualistic culture at all. Then we have the third aspect. Blame for failures, which is part of what I just discussed, is taken on oneself for collectivistic cultures. If they failed in the Olympics, it's all about them. I was given everything I needed to perform the best I could, and I didn't do it. So it is my fault. I failed you. Again, when it comes to a failing for us in the United States or an individualistic culture, that failing tends to be everybody else's fault, not our own fault.